All right. So this week, continuing, this is class number 10 of the Journey to Virtue. The journey continues. And tonight we're building on what we spoke about last week. Last week we spoke about anger. We talked about different categories of anger. And tonight we're going to talk about the detriments of anger. Why it's just not good for anyone, and certainly not for ourselves, to be angry, as well as some deterrents of anger, some ways to cope and deter ourselves from becoming angry. So I'm going to share a story, like I like to start whenever I can. I did share this story at Links about a little more than half a year ago, so some of you may remember the punchline, but we won't test you. I'll be the one to say it. So the story is that there were two people traveling in a city outside of Prague. One was this wealthy man, and the other was his coachman. And this coachman had served him faithfully for many years. He was a good, responsible driver. And this one time they were on their way to Prague, and they stopped at an inn. And in the morning, they shared a room. In the morning, the wealthy man wakes up, and he reaches for his clothes, and they're not there. And he looks around, he says, "Where are my clothes?" And his servant, the coachman, he says, "They're right there on the little side table next to you." So he looks there, and what does he see? He sees some clothing, but it's not his clothing. It's the coachman's clothing. These old, tattered, worn-out clothing, not really fit for this rich merchant. And he says, what are you talking about? What kind of a joke is this? Those are your clothes. Where are my clothes? And then he notices that the coachman is actually wearing his clothes. He says, "What are you doing with my clothes? What is this? What's going on?" So he says, can you give me back my clothes?" So the coachman says, "Enough of this nonsense. What are you talking about? Put your clothes on, get them off that table, and go outside and get the horses ready." Right? This is the coachman talking to the wealthy man, to the merchant. And the merchant's like, "Well, are you out of your mind? Like, what's going on here? Is this a joke? Give me back my clothes and let's get on with our journey." So the coachman looks at him sternly and seriously and threateningly, and he says, you don't understand. From now on, I'm the master and you're my coachman. Now go get the horses ready. Now the coachman was a bit stronger, and the wealthy man the merchant was faced with no choice. He had to listen. Otherwise he would get beaten up or something. Very intimidated, he went and he put on the coachman's old clothing. He went outside, he harnessed the horses, and they continued on their journey to Prague. And the assumption here was that nobody in Prague knew them, and he would this charade would carry on for at least another few days until they got back to their hometown, when people would recognize who was the coachman and who was the wealthy man. But the merchant wasn't too excited about this. He had to put up with all the coachman's orders and all the hard work that he wasn't used to, different types of work. So when they got into Prague, he decided that maybe he can get this settled by going to the rabbi of Prague. The rabbi of Prague at the time was Rabbi Yechezkel Landau, otherwise known as the Noda B'Yehuda. That was one of his great works. And Rabbi Landau was, a great mind and a great judge as well. And he said, can we just go and get this settled by the rabbi? And the coach and the real coachman, who was dressed as the merchant, agreed to this. He said, he figured, there's no proofs here of who's who, and I'll get away with this. The rabbi's not going to be able to prove that I'm really the coachman. So he agreed to go to the Noda B'Yehuda, to Rabbi Landau. So Rabbi Landau listened to their story. This one's claiming he's the coachman, right? The other one's that the coachman is really claiming to be the merchant. Whatever. He listened to the story, the argument, and he told them that I want to speak to each of you individually to settle this. And that way we'll get the story from each of you, and we'll settle it for good. So he says, fine, we'll speak to each of you individually, but then he puts a twist on it and he says, but I'm not ready right now. You'll have to come back tomorrow and we'll talk about it tomorrow. So they say, okay, we'll come back tomorrow. So they come back in the morning, and the Noda Yehuda, he's just finished his morning prayers, and they're waiting in his waiting room anxiously, and they see him come out, and they're hoping, it's time. And he says, sorry, excuse me, I haven't eaten anything yet. I can't really judge this case until I've had something to eat. Would you mind waiting a little bit longer? So they have no choice. They say, okay, we'll wait a little bit longer. So he goes and he eats, and then he comes back. He says, I'm so sorry, but actually I have to go teach a class now, and I can't deal with you right now. Do you mind? I'll come back in a little bit, and we'll work this out. So again, no choice. And he comes back at lunchtime. It's the same thing. He says, I gotta go eat. I'm hungry now. I'll be back in a little bit, and then we'll work it out. And he keeps coming back, and now it's the late afternoon. And these guys are so aggravated. They've just had enough. Like you know what it's like to have to wait a long time, especially when you don't expect to have to wait. It's so frustrating. And these guys are so frustrated. But there's nothing they could do. There's nothing they could do. So finally, they're basically fuming mad. And finally, the rabbi comes out. And he suddenly comes out of his office, he walks into the room, and he says, okay, I'm ready. Coachman, you're first, come on. And what happens? The coachman, the real coachman, pops out of his seat, and he goes off to go to the rabbi. And he says, busted, caught you, right? Even though he was dressed as the merchant, but he was busted when he was caught off guard, and he blew his cover, and the case was solved, and they realized it was quite clear who was the coachman and who was the merchant. And the Noda Yehuda, Rabbi Landau, was exercising here a great strategy, because he knew that if he got them very frustrated and very angry, that their thinking would be impaired. Because that's what happens when we get angry. Our thinking becomes impaired, our judgment isn't as good, and our intelligence is weaker. And even if we have this whole plan in our head, but all of a sudden it could fall apart because of our anger and our frustration. And the truth is that this is one way to understand the Gemara, the piece of Talmud that we talked about last week, which is back on the source sheet as number 1 again. It says that Rabbi Eli said that in 3 matters a person's true character is ascertained: his cup, his pocket, and his anger, right? We mentioned that in Hebrew, these 3 words are very similar: koso, kiso, and kaso. His cup, his pocket, his anger, right? And we said that it refers to what happens when a person drinks his cup, a little wine. What does it do? What does it bring out? How do we spend our money? What do we do with our money? How are we honest in business? And lastly, our anger. What makes us angry, or what happens when we're angry? So one of the commentators explains that what happens when a person is drunk, when a person has a little wine, is that our intellect becomes weakened and gets peeled back. And what remains is just our instincts. Our animalistic instinct is what remains. And the further developed our instincts, the better we'll respond. Even when drunk, the better we'll behave. And that's how the true self comes out, is when what happens, how have we developed ourselves so that when a little bit of that controlling intellect is taken away, what comes out? And the same is true, he says, with anger. Anger has the ability to weaken the intellect, to impair our thinking, and to allow the instincts to take over. And the question is, what's going to happen in that situation when it's just a person sort of reacting automatically? What comes out? What kind of a person? Is there any control left whatsoever? And that's part of what reveals the true essence of a person. But what can happen when we peel back the intellect is we're left with just instinctive reactions and we make bad decisions. And there's two aspects to this, two ramifications, two potential ramifications. One is that we'll make mistakes. We'll make mistakes in judgment. And the second is that when we're angry, we may act improperly. We may come to sin as a result of having bad judgment. So we'll make mistakes just in terms of our calculations, and just, not necessarily, I'm not talking about the, where we do something we make some mathematical errors, calculation errors. We come to error. It's hard to make good judgments. But secondly, also the way that we act can be impaired. Our thinking can be impaired, our decision making, and we can act improperly as a result. So the Gemara, the Talmud actually says in Psachim, it's the second source, Reish Lakish, one of the great rabbis of the Talmud, said, any person who becomes angry, if he is a Torah scholar, his wisdom departs from him. Like even if a person has great wisdom, when they're angry, that wisdom departs. And how does that happen? So it's as we've been explaining. And how does he know it? How does he prove it? He proves it actually, the Gemara there continues, the Talmud continues, and it proves it from Moses. Because we find a number of instances where Moshe actually got angry and then he made a mistake. One of the instances, the particular one that the Talmud quotes as a proof, I didn't include it in the source, but is where the Jewish people had come back from a battle with the Midianites, and they hadn't followed Moshe's exact instructions. Moshe got angry, and then shortly after we see that it's someone else teaching Allah. It's Elazar, the son of Aaron, the Kohen. He's teaching Allah, and the Talmud explains, why wasn't Moshe teaching that law? And the Talmud explains, because he got angry just before, so he forgot the law, so someone else had to teach it. Because when a person is angry, then they make mistakes and they forget important things. But the Rabbi Chaim Shmulevitz points out an interesting thing. There's another example of this that the sages bring in the Midrash, another example where Moshe got angry and he made a mistake. And that was, the Midrash recounts, that was when they dedicated the tabernacle, when they dedicated the Mishkan. So there was a certain offering that it was the Rosh Chodesh offering, that for the new month, and Moshe thought that offering should be consumed by the Kohanim, the meat should be eaten, and because for particular reasons they held and they knew that was incorrect, that this offering was not supposed to be consumed based on the circumstances, it was just supposed to be burnt up. And when Moshe realized that it had been burnt up and not eaten, he got angry, the Torah says. And it says he got angry at the Kohanim, at the priests. So here he is, he's angry at the priests. And it turned out, the Torah relates, that actually he was incorrect. That really, it was supposed to be burnt, it wasn't supposed to be eaten, and Moshe was incorrect. And the Midrash comments, the sages comment, that because he got angry, he made a mistake. Now the problem is that the order doesn't seem to make sense. Because what I just told you is that he made a mistake, he thought they did the wrong thing, and therefore he got angry. Which means what? That the mistake wasn't a result of the anger, right? The anger was a result that he thought they did the wrong thing because he made a mistake. He thought they did the wrong thing, he got angry, but he was wrong. So the mistake actually preceded the anger. So how could the sages comment on this episode and say, you see that anger causes mistakes? It was a mistake that caused his anger. So therefore, one of the great commentaries, the Or HaChaim, says that in fact it must be that he was angry at something else. What was he angry about? He was angry because in that particular episode, the students, the other people there, had ruled in front of him, and that's an insult to Moshe's authority. It's improper behavior. You shouldn't be, imagine you're standing in front of the greatest rabbi, somebody, asks a question and you jump in to answer it. Right? That's a chutzpah. That's disrespectful. And Moshe was angry that they were disrespectful. Not necessarily for his own honor, but that's not the way that one should behave. And therefore, he was angry at their behavior. But once he was angry, then he made a mistake. That's how the Orach Chaim explains it. So Reb Chaim Shmulevitz says what you see from this is that Moshe's anger was certainly justified. But even still, even when the anger is justified, you can still make mistakes as a result. It doesn't matter if this is the right time for anger, it's the wrong time for anger, it's justified, it's not justified. Either way, it has the ability to impair our judgment and to make us forget things. And that's what happened to Moshe. In other words, it's a natural consequence of having that experience, that boiling up, the rage, the wrath, boiling inside of us, or even if it's not boiling, we're frustrated, we're just a little angry, but that's enough to impair our thinking, and that's just a natural result. We see that from Moshe. Moshe, he was absolutely justifying his anger. They had totally, acting in a disrespectful way, and yet it still affected his judgment, and he forgot the law as a result. So that's one ramification, one negative ramification of getting angry, how it impairs our thinking, in that we'll just make judgment mistakes. We'll come up with the wrong answers. A second ramification is, as I mentioned before, that it brings about sin or fighting. Our actions can be destructive as a result of anger. So if you take a look at source number 3, so this is a work of Musar, the Orchos Tzadikim. We've quoted it before, the ways of the righteous, where he goes through different attributes. And in his chapter on anger, we're going to quote it here. We're going to quote it again on the second page extensively. So the Orchos Tzadikim writes as follows. He says, you see people who, when they are angry and persist in their wrath, do not pay attention to what they are doing, and do many things in their anger which they would not do if they were free from anger. We do things that we wouldn't do otherwise. For anger removes a person's intelligence from within him until his angry deeds multiply and he is plunged into strife and quarrel. Therefore, it is impossible for the wrathful person to be saved from great sins. And so did Elijah say to Rabbi Judah, so in the Talmud, fall not into wrath and you will not sin. Basically, don't become angry and then you won't sin. Anger brings about sin. And as he puts it, what happens is when we persist in our wrath, we do not pay attention to what we are doing. We do many things which we would not do otherwise. For anger removes a person's intelligence. Like we said, it peels back the intellect, leaving just those animalistic instincts to emerge. And if you look at the next source, Rabbi Moshe Chaim Luzzatto, also a great work of Musar, the Mesilas Yesharim, the paths of the just, he takes it even a step further. And he says, number 4, there is an anger-prone person about which our sages said, whoever gets angry is as if he worships idols. This person gets angry at anything that is done against his will. He becomes filled with wrath until his heart is no longer with him and his judgment is lost. So far that's along the same lines. A person gets angry, they lose their judgment. But then he says, a man like this, or a person like this, would suffice to destroy the whole world if he had the ability. That's a big line right there. He says such a person would destroy the whole world if they had the ability. For the intellect does not rule over him in the least. He has literally lost his reason, just like all the predatory beasts. So exactly what we've been saying, that when a person's angry, they lose their reason. What's left is just those animalistic instincts. And we see this. We see people who respond with terrible, road rage, right? That's the whole thing, right? They get angry at little things, and then people do crazy things in their anger, really crazy things. Because it peels back the intellect, it peels back our judgment, and what's left is simply the animalistic instinct. We want revenge on the person, whatever it is. And we act people may act as a result in a destructive manner. And And the less control we have over that, the more destructive we can become. And that's what he says. Such a person would destroy the whole world if he had the ability. What holds people back? People who are angry, they just want to destroy. What holds them back? Because they don't have the ability. They know, they're afraid they'll be punished. They'll be locked up in jail. They won't have any friends. It's not good for it's not good for their social life, right? There's things that stop us from acting in a destructive manner. But Mesilas Yesharim is saying, the Ramchal, Rabbi Moshe Chaim Luzzatto is saying something really powerful. He's saying that some people wouldn't stop at destroying the whole world if they could, but they can't, so they don't. But it's the society that holds them back. If you don't have such a society, then they're not necessarily held back. If people support those kinds of destructive actions, then they go ahead and they do it. We actually find, here's a little riddle for you. We find in our history that there was someone who was angry, and as a result, he destroyed 1/4 of the world's population. Anyone know who that was? It's a riddle.
Cain.
Right, yeah. Look at the next source, number 5. And the verse says, but to Cain and to his offering he did not turn. So we have Cain and Havel, Cain and Abel in the Garden of Eden. So there's 4 people around. It's Adam and Eve and Cain and Abel. And as you may recall, so Cain and Abel each brought an offering to God. Abel's offering was accepted. Havel's offering was accepted. Cain's was not. So Cain, he gets angry. And it said, as the verse says, it's in source number 5, but to Cain and to his offering he did not turn. And it angered Cain exceedingly, and his countenance fell. And then just a couple of verses later, it says, and Cain said to Abel his brother, and it came to pass when they were in the field, that Cain rose up against Abel, against Havel his brother, and slew him. So he gets angry, and he says something to his brother, and then he kills him. Right? There's nothing holding him back. There's no, and often you look back to the first source of something in the Torah, it really teaches you something. So here we have the first person to get angry, and we see how destructive it could be. Right? He wiped out 1/4 of the world's population right there. Right? But that's there's nothing holding him back. Then that's what can happen. And it's interesting. Verse number 8, which we have over here, it says, and Cain said to Abel his brother, and it came to pass when they were in the field. It doesn't actually tell us what he said. It's a very strange verse. So all the commentaries jump on this and offer various explanations as to what he said. Some say he repeated what God had just told him in the preceding verses, which I left off the page. But I once heard an answer that the Torah is telling us that he said something to him, but it really doesn't matter what he said, because he had already made up his mind. And Rashi has a comment along these lines that he wanted to get into an argument so that he can have the pretext to kill him. So it doesn't matter what he said. He knew what he just wanted to the situation to explode. He just wanted to have a pretext to get into a fight with his brother. He was so angry with him that he just wanted to go ahead and kill him. So he said something to him. It doesn't really matter what he said. He knew what he was doing. He knew what he planned to do. He just had to have, I guess inside, he needed a little bit of an excuse, a little bit of a pretext to do that, to go ahead and kill him. But it doesn't really matter what he said, because he was so angry. He had already made up his mind that this is what he was going to do. And that, again, this is his brother, right? Comes from a terrible impairment to his judgment. The intellect is removed, and what's left is just this animalistic instinct to strike, and there's nothing really holding him back. There's no society, there's no police, there's nothing, and that's what he does as a result. So that we look all the way back to the very beginning of the Torah, and we have an example of this type of response. And that's, again, the words of Ramchal, of the Mesilas Yesharim, that there's people who would suffice to destroy the whole world if they had the ability. Really strong language. There's a really cute idea. I think I also shared this at Links that is shared about the plague of the frogs in Egypt. So the verse says, I quote, it's number 6 here, that when the Jews were in Egypt, so the second of the 10 plagues was frogs. So it says there that Aaron stretched out his hand over the waters of Egypt, and the frogs came up and covered the land of Egypt. In Hebrew, it says Vayal hatzvardeya, and the tzvardeya, the frog, singular, came up and went on to cover the land of Egypt. So the Talmud wonders, why does it say it in the singular? Now, Rashi, the great commentator Rashi, he quotes the Talmud's answer, but he also admits, he says, certainly the simple understanding is that the word tzvardeya can be used, even though it's the singular, it's also the plural. It's kind of like we say fish, right? 1 fish, 2 fish, right? So the same thing in Hebrew with the word tzvardeya, which is frog. It's the singular and the plural it can be the same in certain contexts. So simply understood, even though it says that the frog, well, yeah, it really means the frogs went out to Egypt. But the Talmud has a different interpretation, and Rashi quotes it. It's actually a dispute in the Talmud, but one of the opinions is that there was originally 1 frog. There was just 1 at the beginning, this huge frog. And the Egyptians saw this big frog, and if you see a huge frog, what do? You grab a stick and you smack it. So that's what they did. They saw this big frog and they smacked it. And they were smacking it and smacking it. And it wasn't dying. In fact, instead, it was producing more and more frogs. They were jumping out of its mouth. Every time they hit it, more and more frogs jumped out. So the late rabbi from the previous generation, Rabbi Yaakov Yisrael Kanievsky, posed the question, if they saw that every time they hit it, more frogs came out, then why did they keep hitting the frog, right? Didn't they learn their lesson? Stop hitting the frog. So he answers, based on, a similar idea to what we're talking about. He says, why they kept hitting the frog? It's true, it wasn't a good idea, but they were so mad that they didn't have the judgment to stop. And sometimes a person in their anger can act destructively even to themselves, and they just don't have the vision and the control over their actions and their decisions to make the right decision, even if what they're doing is destructive to themselves. And that's what the Egyptians were doing as they continued to hit the frog. Even though it was destructive to themselves, they kept on doing it. Okay. Just anybody want to comment or question before we continue? Okay. Now, last week, we talked about the Mishnah, the teaching of the sages in Pirkei Avos, Ethics of the Fathers, and it's number 7. We said there are 4 kinds of temperaments. There's one person who is easy to become angry and easy to be appeased. They get angry easily, but they're easily appeased. And it said in the Mishnah that person's gain disappears in his loss. And then there was someone who was hard to become angry and hard to be appeased, and his loss disappears in his gain. There's the one who's hard to become angry and easy to be appeased. That's pious. You rarely get angry. When you do, you're easily appeased. That's pious. And then there's one who's easy to become angry and hard to be appeased. Gets angry all the time and doesn't get appeased. That's a wicked person. That's a rasha. Now, what does this first clause mean? Easy to become angry and easy to be appeased. His gain disappears in his loss. What does that mean? So the great commentary on Pirkei Avos, Rabbeinu Yonah, says as follows. It's number 8 there. A person who is easy to anger and easy to appease, his gain is canceled by his loss, as the loss is greater than the gain. What it means is it's true. You have a great attribute that you're easy to be appeased, but the negative attribute of becoming angry easily cancels that out. And he explains, what is the use of his being appeased quickly, since his anger lies in his lap? That's based on I saw an idea. There's a verse that has a similar expression, that when something is in your lap, like if you get up, it just, it falls off. So that's like somebody who gets angry easily, that it's like having the anger in their lap. Every time they get up, that it just explodes, it falls off. So, but in any event, he says that since his anger lies in his lap and he is easily angry and acts sinfully for a short time, so what's the use that he gets appeased quickly? Why? What's his question? So he explains, because who will be able to fix what he has made crooked? That's quoting a verse. During the time of his anger, even if he is quickly appeased. Who can fix what he's already damaged? In other words, what the Mishnah is teaching us, according to Rabbeinu Yonah, is that if somebody gets angry easily and reacts to that anger, even if they could be appeased shortly after that, and the anger will subside, but often it's too late. The loss is negated. The gain, the benefit of being able to rid yourself of anger quickly is negated in the loss and the destruction that can be caused by that moment of anger. Because a person can cause irreparable damage in just a moment of anger. They can, whether it's physical damage, whether it's to relationships, you say one wrong thing and you could do serious damage. So what the Mishnah is teaching us is that it's not enough to be able to become appeased quickly, but we also have to try to deter ourselves from really getting angry in the first place. Now, continuing on, we're going to now go through a number of other detriments. And I think it's important the reason why I think it's part of learning Musar, part of developing ourselves, is just talking about the attributes, talking about the midos. So as I mentioned last week, it's good always to focus, to have them in our mind. And then when we, let's say in this example, when we feel ourselves getting frustrated or getting angry, so we'll be mindful of what we learned about and how we have to try to take control. But also, when we talk about all the detriments, why it's so futile and damaging for ourselves to become angry, so that too, we can think of that. If we feel ourselves starting to get aggravated, to get upset, then we remind ourselves what kind of damage we could cause. So we've already spoken about how it impairs our thinking. We make errors in judgment. We may come to do something that we regret. We may come to say something that we regret. Those are probably the most serious of the serious detriments, serious problems that could come if we get angry. Orchos Tzadikim now lists a whole host of other things that we should be concerned about and reasons to stay as far from anger as we can. So we're going to go through them. It's number 9 here, and I just picked out a few from his chapter. So we'll start with the first paragraph. We're now on the top of the second page. First paragraph says, and our sages said, an intolerant person is not fit to teach, for because of his great anger, the pupils fear him too much to ask the things of which they are in doubt, lest he be wrathful with them. So first of all, he's quoting another Mishnah, another teaching of the sages in Avos. An intolerant person is not fit to teach. That if we're intolerant, if we get angry easily, then we can't teach. Because the students, they're going to be afraid to ask questions because the teacher gets angry with them. And even when his pupils do ask, even if they do ask a question, well, the impatient teacher, when they do ask the impatient teacher questions, he does not possess the heart to explain to his pupils all that is needed to make the matter clear. He also answers questions in anger, and thus the pupils will not understand the matter clearly. So if we don't have tolerance for our students, so then they'll be afraid to ask us questions, and even if they ask us, we're not going to answer them properly, and that's a detriment as a teacher that comes about from anger. But the truth is, we're all teachers. Certainly, if we're parents, we're teachers, but we're teachers to each other, we're teachers to our peers, and And we all have something to teach, and there will always be situations where somebody will want, will be able to learn from us. But if we act in anger and we're intolerant and we're impatient with them, so then we're not going to be able to teach. It just doesn't work. It doesn't get across when it's given over in anger. There's a great story about Rabbi Shlomo Volbe. He once observed a father in shul, in the synagogue, trying to get his son to sit down and pray, to sit down and daven. And it was a young boy. I guess he was old enough to daven, but he was also, a boy. He was rambunctious, couldn't sit for so long, and he was getting out of his chair and climbing on it and who knows what else. And the father's trying to get him to just sit, sit properly. And eventually the father got angry. He lost his cool. And he yelled at the kid. He said, "Sit down. Don't you know how important it is to pray to God? Don't you know how important it is to daven, to treat the shul with respect? Just sit in your seat." And the child got the message, as can happen when somebody raises their voice. We may get the message. And the child sat down in his seat for the rest of davening, and he davened, he prayed. Now, Rabbi Volbe observed this. He was there too. And afterwards, he came over to the father and he told him, "I'll just tell you," he said, "you taught your son two things today." He said, "You taught him that it's very important to daven, to pray, and to have respect for the shul. That's one thing that you taught him. You also taught him that it's acceptable to get angry like that." He says, "I'm not sure that he'll remember how important it is to daven, but I bet that he'll probably remember that it's okay to get angry." That was his lesson. And at the end of the day, the idea is that we have to model good behavior for our children, for each other. And what we tell our children, right, if we tell them, you have to pray, you have to daven, so, they may learn, but it's not as effective as role modeling. And in this case, where he was saying one thing, but he was modeling a different type of behavior, he was modeling anger. So what is most likely the child will walk away with? They're not going to walk away with what the father told them. They're going to walk away with what the father did, what they observed, what the father modeled. So if we want to be able to teach, we want someone to listen, we have to be patient with them. And second of all, if we're not, then we're not just not going to get our message across so well, but we're also going to model that kind of behavior, that angry behavior, and that's, of course, not a good thing. The second thing he said we have here, the second paragraph in number 9, the angry man does not find favor in the eyes of his fellow beings. He is in fact hateful in their eyes, and thus his deeds are not received favorably by his fellow beings. Even if he possesses knowledge of the Torah and has many good deeds to his credit, people cannot learn from him. At the end of the day, right, we can have someone who has so many good traits. They may be a great Torah scholar, they may do great deeds, but if we witness them that they have an anger problem and they get angry regularly, then we lose all respect for them. That's just what will happen. And all of that there is to learn from them, we won't learn from them, right? If there's one, sometimes when there's just one serious character flaw, it kind of negates everything else that a person has going for them in our ability. It's just natural in our ability. If we don't respect them, then we can't learn from them. And we're not, people don't respect someone who, just blows his top, on a regular basis. So if we ever feel ourselves getting angry, we should be reminded that it's not, like I said, it's not good for our social circles, right? It doesn't bode well for our relationships. Just besides for that, it hurts the relationship here, but it just doesn't look good, and people lose respect. And that's another thing to keep in mind. Don't get angry; it causes people to lose respect for us. If we don't, by the way, the opposite is so true. If somebody is so good at keeping their cool, then people have tremendous respect for such a person. When we witness someone, we talked about on a different week the situation where someone's being insulted, and they don't respond. When we see that, so we have such respect for such a person. If somebody's insulted and being yelled at or whatever it is, and they just ignore it and they don't get angry. So that builds up our respect for that person. The third paragraph here says, the angry man is a burden on his household, who are always compelled to hear his wrath and his complaints, and his temper brings him very near to a calamity, for he casts too much terror on his household. As we learn in the Talmud concerning Rabbi Hanina, the son of Gamliel, his household was brought almost to the point of feeding him a piece of meat cut from a living creature. So there's a prohibition in the Torah to eat a piece of meat that was cut off the animal before the animal was slaughtered. It's called Aver Min Hachai, a limb from a living animal. And the Talmud has a story of Rabbi Hanina, who it seems was someone who was angry in his house. And at some point they had this meat, and I guess I didn't have a chance to look up the exact story, but they almost fed it to him because they didn't want to admit, or they didn't want to say what it was because they were afraid that he would get angry, and they almost gave it to him as a result. And that can happen if a person, in the words over here, if he casts too much terror on his household, if he or she, if people are scared of them because they're scared to make them angry, what will happen if I tell them, right? If a child is afraid to share something with their parents because they're afraid of the anger that it may cause, then what's going to happen? They're not going to tell them, right? And then who knows what's going to happen in the household. So it's important. We want people who are around us to be themselves and to be honest with us. And if because we act in a certain way, they're not going to come clean, and they're not going to act honestly because they're afraid of us, then that's obviously a bad situation. And that's what he's talking about here. First of all, don't be a burden on your household. They don't want to have to, it's terrible to make them deal with that. Anger and people raising their voices is just not a pleasant way to live, obviously. But additionally, it's not good for the person who's angry either, because that then people aren't themselves. They hide things, and you just want people to be honest when they're with us and to be able to be themselves. And the fourth paragraph here says that the angry man bars from himself all guidance and rebuke. Someone who gets angry it's hard to improve because nobody is willing to point out our flaws, because what happens if they point something out? Well, I'm going to blow my stack at them. I'm going to get angry. If they criticize me, I'm going to get angry. I'm going to argue. And therefore, such a person can't grow. They can't improve because people are afraid to tell them if they're doing something wrong. And if someone does rebuke them, then the angry man will not accept it because of his anger. And he says, in general terms, an angry man does not acquire any good quality unless he first removes his anger from his heart. In order to be able to develop our good qualities, we need help. We need people. We need to be able to admit to our flaws, and we need sometimes a little guidance. And if we have a temper, then we're not likely to get that, or we're not likely to accept any musar, any guidance, any rebuke, and we won't improve as a result. So that's a further detriment to being an angry person, is that we can't improve in our character. So just a number of there's plenty more detriments and reasons why it's a bad idea to become angry, but this should be enough for someone to think about when they feel themselves that frustration coming through, that maybe I should take a deep breath and not allow it to come through because of all of the negative consequences of reacting angrily. So that's one strategy, really. Aside from just studying the topic and being mindful of it, another strategy is focusing specifically on the negative consequences, how detrimental it is to us, how destructive it is, how it's really not something that we want to live with. We're so much better off if we don't have this, if we're able to overcome that anger. Additionally, another strategy, another way to try to cope with anger is that if we feel ourselves becoming frustrated, aggravated, angry, we should ask ourselves, why am I getting angry? Try to pinpoint what the cause of that anger is, and then ask ourselves, is it really worth getting angry about? Is it worth getting worked up about? The most common reason for anger is when we feel that, or to be annoyed, is when we feel that our ego is affronted, is insulted. We feel some kind of jab at that ego. So as we mentioned, one situation is criticism. If someone criticizes us, so that implies that I have a fault, right? And it's even worse if it comes from my wife, a person's spouse. We see them as, their job is to tell us how perfect we are. And that's how people think. And so if we hear criticism from anyone, and certainly from a spouse, then that implies that I have a fault. And our egos don't like that. And what happens as a result is we start to get angry. And we have to be able to catch that, right? Somebody criticizes us and we start to heat up and start to get defensive. And as soon as we feel that, we have to stop ourselves and say, wait, why all of a sudden is my body temperature like 105 degrees? What happened? Why do I feel this way? And realize, it's because I was criticized. My ego took a hit. Take a deep breath, and just let it go. It's just my ego. I know I'm not perfect. If we hear someone else being praised, then we're jealous. Why are they being praised and not me? That can make a person angry. Jealousy can make a person angry. And again, it's just like, it's our ego again coming through. Why are they getting the praise? Why am I not getting the praise? If somebody is disobeying us, right? We tell someone who is supposed to listen to us to do something, a family member, right? A student, and they don't listen. So, right? Or we ask someone to do something who's not necessarily, someone who we'd say they're supposed to listen to us, but we ask for a favor from someone and they don't do it, or they don't do it properly, and we say, what, I'm not important to you? My wishes aren't important to you? And again, it's the ego. It's not that you're not important to me. There's usually a good reason for it, but we immediately start to get angry because we feel that it's an insult to us. Obviously, I'm not important enough. That's why you're not listening. And one common example where in marriage where tempers get worked up is when a husband and wife are working on something together. They're working on a project and they disagree on what's the best way to proceed. He wants to do it this way, she wants to do it that way. Each is insulted that the other doesn't respect their intelligence and their decision, and it sometimes builds up into an argument. When again, we have to stop and realize, why am I getting so worked up? Because they disagree with me. It's okay. They could disagree with me. It's not the end of the world. And it's not necessarily an insult to me. They just have a different opinion. And this is really common, not just with husbands and wives, but this is now, talk about it a lot in our society, but it's, people disagree on issues or on politics, and they get so worked up because someone else thinks differently. And we get so angry. And okay, what are we, if we think about it, like why are we getting so heated? I mean, I get heated in arguments also. I'm speaking to myself. Not some, I don't know if it's about politics so much that I get so heated, but if I feel strongly about something, then I get heated, but it doesn't really make sense, because so what if the other person thinks differently? Like if there's an actual consequence to me, so that's one thing. I shouldn't get angry, but like I can actually understand that. But when there's no consequence whatsoever, it's just a matter of different opinions, then like we have to ask ourselves, why are we getting so worked up? Does it really make a difference? So when we feel ourselves getting aggravated, we have to stop, think, why am I angry? And sometimes if we can identify, pinpoint, it's because I feel insulted, my ego. It's really my ego. If they think differently than me, that means that they don't, and I can't convince them, then they don't respect my opinion. And so as much as I try to convince them, they're still not listening to me. How could that be? And we end up getting angry. But it's really just our ego that's taking a hit. And again, in all these situations, we have to ask ourselves, all the things we talked about. Remember how detrimental and damaging it is to become angry. Is it really worth it? And is it worth it to destroy relationships with friends, with family, over these little arguments? I probably not, right? But that's what people do all the time. One way, Rabbi Frand writes this, one clue to whether something is worth arguing about, worth being angry about, not saying it's always worth it, but one way to stop ourselves in our tracks and consider is to think, is this still going to be, will I still be angry about this in 2 days from now? If we could stop as we're feeling that aggravation building and say, will I still be angry about this in 2 days from now? And if the answer is no, then it's probably not that important. If it's such an important matter of God's name is being desecrated, so then I'm upset about that, whether it's today or tomorrow or the next day. That's always going to bother me. But if it's just some little thing that's not going to bother me in 2 days, then it's probably not worth getting angry about. And usually with time, the anger abates. And that's really another strategy. Besides for thinking what will happen, will I still be angry in 2 days from now, is sometimes we just have to create that delay. If we can create the delay, we feel the aggravation, we feel the anger, and then we could create a mechanism to delay our reaction. So that also helps to control that. The verse in Koheles, in Ecclesiastes, it's number 10 here. It says, don't let your spirit be quickly angered, for anger abides in the laps of fools. That's in the laps, right? If it's in your lap and it just comes out easily, so that's foolish. But it says, don't let your spirit be quickly angered. If you're slowly angered, maybe sometimes there's reason for it. But if you're quickly angered, give it some time. If it's still making you angry, then that's one thing. But give it some time. And sometimes we have to buy that time. So the story is told, Rabbi Shlomo Freifeld, who I've spoken about before, he once had a student burst into his house one night. He was really angry at his parents, this student. And he rushes in and he starts ranting, saying to his rabbi how, this is what my parents said or did, and it's so terrible. So Rabbi Freifeld was quiet. He listened for a moment, and he turned to his wife and he asked her would you mind bringing a cup of tea? And she brought the tea, and he handed it to the boy, to the student, and he said, drink this, and then let's talk. So the student took a sip, and then he continued in his rant. And Rabbi Freifeld said, no, drink the whole cup, and then we'll talk. And by the time he drank the whole cup of hot tea, so his anger had diminished greatly, and then they could have a civil conversation about the matter. And along similar lines, so the legend is that there was a Hasidic Rebbe. He had a magic cure for marital harmony issues. And if a couple came to him and they would, they want to resolve their disputes and their issues, he would give them magic water. And he told them that whenever you start to fight, whenever you start to have an argument, you should each take some of this magic water and swish it around in your mouth for a few minutes. And then your arguments will all go away. And that was his magic potion. So whenever his holy water, because by the time you swish it around in your mouth for a few minutes, the anger subsides and you can talk about the matter in a civil way. Sometimes you just have to walk into another room. And it's important, if we're in a quarrel with someone and the other person walks into the other room, we don't go after them, right? They're making a move to end the argument, to put away the frustration and the aggravation. We don't go chasing after them. You could finish the discussion another time with cooler heads, but they walk into another room. That's a good thing, you know. That ends the argument for now, and then you can, when everyone's cool, you could continue the discussion if it's worth it. Often it's not, right? Often it's not worth continuing. Now, if we sometimes do need to raise our voice, let's say at home, you educate our children once in a while, you have to raise your voice, but we have to be careful that it's not actually coming from real anger. Sometimes we have to feign anger. We have to feign that we're upset to get a message across. But if that's the case, then we have to know that we're not actually angry. They say about Rabbi Baruch Ber Leibowitz, he was the head of the yeshiva in Kamenetz in Europe before the war, and I believe I once heard that when he felt the need to yell at a student for something that the student did wrong, so he would walk to his office. He had a special hat that he put on. He would put on this hat, and then he would come back. So by the time he was ready to yell at the student, to raise his voice, there was no anger left in him. It was just purely coming from the desire to educate. That was the style of education that he felt was needed in that situation. But at that point, there was no anger left because he took a walk and then he came back, and now it was just purely an educational lecture. And finally, we can just think about what it looks like when a person gets angry, and that itself should, we can either go look in the mirror when we're angry, or just, we've all seen people, yell at their kids in the street, and not to judge, I don't know what we never know what they're dealing with. We usually say, oh, they can't control their kids and they can't control their anger, right? It looks bad, whether it's justified or not, but it's embarrassing. And if we think about how we might look to other people when we get angry, so maybe that also could dissuade us from reacting in such a manner. So to sum it all up, we talked about the detriments of anger, that it impairs our intellect, it impairs our judgment, we make mistakes, we act improperly as a result, and if we keep that in mind, then perhaps that will dissuade us, that will prevent us from getting angry too quickly. One moment of anger could do irreparable damage. We want to just delay the reaction if possible. We have to sometimes create ways to delay. We have to ask ourselves, why am I angry? Try to pinpoint it, because often we'll find, if we can, that it's just all about our ego. We just feel insulted. We feel, and if we can move past that, then our anger will subside. And finally, we said that there are a number of other detriments that we mentioned. We mentioned that we can't teach if we're angry. We mentioned that people just don't respect us if we're too quick to anger. We become a burden on people, on the house. People don't act themselves around us. And we can't grow if we get too angry. If we respond to criticism combatively, then to criticism and guidance in that way, then we can't really grow. And these are all things that are good to keep in mind. And if we do, then hopefully when that moment comes and there's something that starts to rile us up, we'll be able to just rein ourselves in and take control quickly and respond in a respectful and proper manner. Okay.
Bye, Rabbi. Thank you.
Thanks, Rabbi Shaps. Have a good night.
No problem. Thanks for joining.
Thank you very much.